For June 1944, in the sweltering jungles of the Pacific, American fighter squadrons faced a cruel arithmetic: fuel versus survival. Every mile flown toward enemy lines meant one less chance to return home. Pilots cursed the limits of their machines. The majestic P-38 Lightning, fast but thirsty, while Japanese fighters ruled the skies over distant islands. Then, from the shadows of controversy and exile, a civilian arrived, a man the military neither trusted nor wanted. His name? Charles Lindbergh. Once the most celebrated aviator on Earth, now branded a political outcast, Lindbergh walked onto a remote airstrip in New Guinea, armed not with medals or orders, but with mathematics. He claimed he could teach America's finest pilots to fly farther, fight longer, and survive against all odds, by defying every rule they'd been taught. Commanders called him reckless. Pilots called him insane. But when Lindbergh climbed into a P-38 and proved them all wrong, extending its range deep into enemy territory, the Pacific War changed forever. This is not a story of medals or ranks. It's the story of one man who outsmarted the US military with nothing but genius, courage, and a pilot's instinct for survival. The story begins not with the roar of engines or the chaos of battle, but in silence. The silence of a man who had fallen from grace. In the years before World War II, Charles Lindbergh was a name known across every corner of the globe. The first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, he had symbolized everything daring and modern about American aviation. But fame turned to infamy. His public speeches opposing US entry into the war, and his perceived sympathies toward Germany, made him a pariah once the conflict ignited. The same government that once celebrated him now wanted nothing to do with him. His reputation was shattered, his name whispered with bitterness in military halls. Yet behind the public disgrace, Lindbergh's fascination with aviation science never dimmed. He studied engine performance, aerodynamic drag, and fuel efficiency with an obsession that bordered on madness. When America entered the Pacific War, Lindbergh was officially sidelined, stripped of his commission, and left to watch as the skies he once conquered became the greatest theater of war in human history. But history has a strange way of calling back those who understand it best. In 1944, as the U.S. Air Forces battled across the Pacific Islands, a new problem emerged: range. The P-38 Lightning, one of the most formidable fighters in the Allied arsenal, was fast, heavily armed, and deadly at high altitudes. But its fuel consumption was a nightmare. Missions deep into enemy territory often ended in tragedy, not from combat, but from empty fuel tanks over vast stretches of ocean. No amount of courage could compensate for physics, and the military's engineers seemed resigned to those limits. Somewhere in his quiet exile, Lindbergh saw the reports. He recognized the familiar numbers: manifold pressure, RPM, fuel mixture ratios, all bound by conservative training that insisted running engines over square would destroy them. To Lindbergh, this was nonsense. He knew engines could operate beyond those limits safely, if handled with precision. What the manuals called dangerous, he saw as misunderstood potential. He understood that aviation wasn't just about bravery, it was about mastery. He had learned it the hard way, alone over the Atlantic, with every calculation of fuel and air pressure meaning life or death. Unable to ignore what he saw as a critical flaw in the U.S. Air Force's thinking, Lindbergh reached out through quiet channels. He offered his expertise, not as a soldier, but as a consultant. His name still carried enough weight in the aviation industry that a few senior officers listened cautiously. After tense discussions and much hesitation, he was granted permission to visit the front lines in the Pacific. He would have no rank, no authority, and no recognition. He would simply observe. But Lindbergh had no intention of just watching. When he arrived in the Pacific, the scene was surreal, a living contradiction. The once celebrated hero, now a civilian in a wrinkled khaki shirt, stepped onto a humid, mud-soaked airfield surrounded by combat-hardened pilots who barely concealed their contempt. Many of them had lost friends to the Japanese Zero, and the idea of taking advice from a civilian, and worse, from Lindbergh, felt insulting. But Lindbergh didn't argue. He didn't need to. His calm, almost detached demeanor carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent years alone in the cockpit. He spoke not like a politician, but like a pilot who knew every vibration, every tremor of a piston engine. He began by asking questions that no one else did. How long did they cruise before combat? What settings did they use? How often did they lean the mixture? He noticed how the pilots operated under strict doctrine. Maximum RPM, conservative manifold pressure, full, rich mixture. The same textbook rules that wasted fuel at alarming rates. You're flying by fear, he told one pilot, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. Fear of breaking an engine that's built to go farther than you let it. The pilots laughed at first. Then they watched. Lindbergh's approach was methodical, almost surgical. He reviewed data, ran calculations, and pored over flight logs late into the night by lantern light. Every change he proposed seemed radical. Lower RPMs to 1/600, increase manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, and shift to auto, lean mixture during cruise. To the military instructors, this was heresy. To Lindbergh, it was logic. You can't fight a long war with short thinking, he wrote in his notes. The tension was palpable. Lindbergh was no longer just a visitor. He was a challenge to the institution itself. And in war, challenges to authority are rarely welcome. Yet there was something magnetic about his conviction, something undeniable about his quiet certainty. The younger pilots began to listen. They saw the math. They heard the reasoning, and for the first time, they began to wonder if the old man might be right. In the isolation of a far-flung Pacific base, one man had begun to question the most sacred rules of the U.S. Air Forces. He had no rank, no uniform, and no allies. Only experience and the courage to defy the manual. The seeds of revolution in aerial warfare had been planted. Not in a laboratory or command room, but in the mind of a disgraced pilot who refused to accept that the limits of his nation's machines were fixed. And soon, the world would see just how far his defiance could fly. The transport plane touched down on a rough coral airstrip, carved out of the steaming jungles of New Guinea. It was June 1944, and the war in the Pacific had become a brutal test of endurance. American pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, were flying daily missions against Japanese bases, scattered across the vast ocean expanse. Their enemy wasn't just the Imperial Japanese Air Force. It was distance. Every sortie stretched their fuel tanks to the edge, and every return flight was a race against time. Into this crucible of exhaustion and attrition stepped a man no one expected to see, Charles Lindbergh. The civilian who had once symbolized American aviation glory, but now wore no insignia, carried no orders, and bore the quiet burden of disgrace. The pilots watched from the shade of their tents as the newcomer climbed down from the aircraft. He was lean, sunburned, and unassuming. No rank, no entourage. Just a leather flight bag, slung over his shoulder, and a notebook tucked under one arm. To the young flyers who had grown up idolizing the Lone Eagle of 1927, it was surreal. They had read about his transatlantic flight, seen his face on postage stamps, and listened to his radio addresses. But this man before them was no celebrity. He was a ghost from another era. Some whispered, "What's he doing here?" Others muttered darker things, recalling his Pruwa speeches and isolationist stance. The Pacific Front was no place for politics, but his presence stirred quiet resentment. The base commander greeted him formally, though not warmly. Lindbergh introduced himself simply and asked for permission to observe operations. His voice was calm, deliberate, and carried the authority of experience. He didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't boast about his record or his knowledge. He just listened. That, more than anything, intrigued the pilots. For days he said little, moving between hangars, studying the maintenance logs, and speaking with crew chiefs about fuel performance and engine wear. He examined the Allison engines on the P-38 Lightnings with the familiarity of an engineer who knew every gear and cylinder by heart. When he finally addressed the pilots, it wasn't with lectures. It was with questions. How far can you fly before you must turn back? He asked. How much fuel do you use on a standard patrol? The answers came quickly, but Lindbergh pressed deeper. Have you tested different RPMs? What's your manifold pressure at cruise? The room fell silent. Most had never questioned the manual settings. They flew the way they were trained. The doctrine was sacred. Deviating from it meant risking an engine failure, or worse, a court-martial. Lindbergh's brow furrowed as he studied their responses. The military's fear of pushing engines, over square, running higher manifold pressures with lower RPMs, was costing them precious range. He knew this from years of experimentation during his own long-distance flights. Engines don't fail because of pressure, he explained softly. They fail because of ignorance. The younger pilots exchanged skeptical glances. To them, this was heresy. But to Lindbergh, it was engineering truth. Outside the tent, the humid air shimmered with heat and the smell of aviation fuel. He walked among the parked P-30As, their twin booms gleaming in the sunlight, and imagined the vast distances they could reach, if flown differently. He asked permission to accompany the next mission as an observer, but the commander hesitated. A civilian in combat. The idea was absurd. Yet Lindbergh persisted. He wasn't there to sit behind a desk. He wanted to fly, to see for himself the limits the military had imposed on its own machines. Over the next days, Lindbergh joined practice flights, sitting in the cockpit beside combat veterans half his age. He took notes on engine response, fuel consumption, and throttle settings. Every test confirmed what he already suspected. The planes were burning more fuel than necessary, because doctrine prioritized caution over efficiency. The engineers and pilots had been told never to exceed a certain ratio between power and engine revolutions. But Lindbergh, who had once crossed the Atlantic on a knife's edge of fuel calculations, knew that precision flying could unlock endurance far beyond what the manuals promised. His findings began to circulate quietly among the squadrons. A few curious pilots, impressed by his calm professionalism, started experimenting with his recommended settings: 600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, and a leaner fuel mixture. To their amazement, they returned from missions with significantly more fuel left in their tanks. The whispers spread quickly. The hold man might actually be right. But the upper command remained wary. Allowing a civilian, especially that civilian, to influence flight operations was politically dangerous. Lindbergh's reputation made him a liability as much as an asset. Yet results spoke louder than caution. One by one, skeptical pilots saw their combat range expand by dozens, then hundreds, of miles. They could now reach enemy targets that had previously been deemed out of range. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the jungle canopy, Lindbergh could be seen at the edge of the airfield, staring out toward the horizon. He wasn't chasing fame or redemption. He was chasing perfection, the kind that only a pilot who had once stared into the endless Atlantic sky could understand. His arrival at that forgotten airstrip in New Guinea marked the quiet beginning of a revolution in air warfare. It wasn't declared in a briefing room or announced by generals. It began in the patient calculations of a man who refused to let knowledge go to waste. The pilots who had once mocked him would soon call him the man who taught us to fly farther than fear. And from that small, muddy base, the course of the Pacific Air War began to shift, one recalculated throttle at a time. The air at the New Guinea base was thick with humidity and tension. Word had spread among the pilots that Lindbergh had brought with him a radical idea, one that defied everything they had been taught about flying. To the veterans of the 475th Fighter Group, it sounded absurd. A civilian, a man without uniform or authority, was claiming he could make their P-38 Lightnings fly hundreds of miles farther simply by adjusting a few dials. The manuals said his method was dangerous. Flight instructors had drilled it into every pilot: never run your engines over square. Never set your manifold pressure higher than your RPM ratio. To do so was to invite engine failure, detonation, and death. But Lindbergh had come to prove that the manuals were wrong. He began his instruction not in the air, but on the ground, in the most unassuming way possible. In the operations tent, beneath the drone of ceiling fans, and the distant rumble of departing aircraft, Lindbergh stood before a chalkboard. On it, he drew the familiar diagram of a piston engine cylinders, propeller, crankshaft, and fuel mixture controls. The pilots gathered around, some curious, others openly skeptical. He spoke in a calm, analytical tone, like an engineer explaining the fine art of balance. An engine, he said, is a machine of harmony. Every movement, every pressure, every explosion of fuel, it's all part of a rhythm. If you understand that rhythm, you can control it far more efficiently than your manual allows. He began explaining his theory. That the key to long-range flight wasn't more fuel, but smarter use of it. Most pilots ran their engines at high revolutions per minute, RPM with moderate manifold pressure, believing it was safer and smoother. But that approach consumed vast amounts of fuel and overstressed the pistons. Lindbergh proposed the opposite: reduce the RPM to 1/600, far below normal, and increase manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury. Then, switch to auto-lean mixture, allowing less fuel into the combustion chambers. On paper, this was heresy. Yet Lindbergh insisted it would not harm the engines. In fact, he argued, the lower RPM would reduce wear, while the higher pressure would maintain power output. The pilots looked at one another. It sounded like a trick. "You're saying we've been flying wrong this whole time?" one of them asked. Lindbergh smiled faintly. "Not wrong," he said, just cautiously. "War doesn't reward caution, it rewards understanding." That night, he joined the mechanics in the hangar, testing throttle responses and fuel flow on an idling P-38. He ran the numbers, compared engine temperatures, and scribbled notes into his worn, leather journal. The mechanics, initially dismissive, began to take interest when the results held steady. The engines didn't overheat. The oil pressure stayed within safe limits. The roar of the Allison engines deepened into a low, steady hum. "Listen to that," Lindbergh said, raising his voice over the propeller wash. "She's happier like this." A few days later, he took a willing pilot up for a demonstration flight. The young lieutenant, skeptical but intrigued, watched as Lindbergh handled the controls with a precision born of long habit. "Most men fly their airplanes," he said, adjusting the mixture lever. "But few understand them. They climb to cruising altitude and leveled off." Lindbergh adjusted the RPM and manifold settings, explaining each movement. The lieutenant expected the engine to sputter or stall, but instead, it purred smoothly. Over the intercom, Lindbergh asked, "Notice anything?" The pilot glanced at his fuel gauge. The rate of consumption had dropped dramatically. "That's not supposed to happen," he muttered. Lindbergh simply nodded. "That's what they said about flying solo across the Atlantic, too." By the time they landed, the young pilot was a convert. Word spread through the base like wildfire. Others began experimenting under Lindbergh's supervision, testing different combinations, and reporting similar results. Flights that used to burn nearly all their fuel reserves were now returning with enough for an extra 100 miles. It seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Senior officers grew uneasy. If Lindbergh's method became official, it meant the Army Air Forces had been wrong for years. A dangerous admission in wartime. Engineers were ordered to review his data, and many tried to disprove it. But every test confirmed the same thing: Lindbergh's technique worked. It didn't just save fuel, it extended combat range by nearly 1/3. For a war fought across an ocean, that was revolutionary. Lindbergh continued refining his methods, calculating optimal climb settings, cruise altitudes, and mixture ratios for maximum range. He took personal risks, often flying solo test missions into enemy airspace to verify his theories. Each time he returned safely, the respect around him grew. The younger pilots began calling him the professor, half in jest, half in awe. But beneath his calm exterior, Lindbergh knew the danger of what he was doing. One engine failure, one crash, and the military would dismiss him forever. Yet he pushed forward, convinced that understanding the machine was worth any personal risk. His impossible technique wasn't born from arrogance, but necessity, a blend of instinct and science forged in the crucible of isolation and flight. By the end of that summer, the results could no longer be ignored. The P-38 Lightning, once limited to 570 miles of effective combat range, was now reaching 750. Missions that once seemed suicidal were becoming routine. And all of it began with a single idea written on a chalkboard in a sweltering tent. An idea that dared to challenge military orthodoxy and prove that genius, when guided by discipline, could change the outcome of a war. The moment of truth came not in a briefing room or behind a desk, but in the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that had become the backbone of the American air campaign in the Pacific. Charles Lindbergh, a civilian by definition, climbed into the aircraft with the calm, deliberate precision of a man who had spent decades in the skies. Around him, the mechanics ran through pre-flight checks, glancing warily at the unarmed man in a khaki shirt and leather helmet. To them, the idea of a civilian flying combat missions was reckless, even absurd. Yet Lindbergh's confidence was unwavering. He knew that theory alone was insufficient. It would be the proof of action, the demonstration of technique under real conditions, that would convince the skeptics. He began with careful planning. Each mission was charted meticulously. The distances measured against fuel consumption charts he had prepared in the shadows of the jungle base. The pilots assigned to accompany him, many of them America's top aces, were initially apprehensive. Thomas Maguire and Richard Bong, legends in their own right, watched as Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit. They had survived countless dogfights and known the limitations of the P-38 firsthand. If Lindbergh failed, it could be fatal and embarrassing. But curiosity overcame fear. As the engines roared to life, Lindbergh's hands moved over the controls with precision, adjusting RPM and manifold pressure in accordance with the methods he had taught. He reduced the throttle to 1,600 RPM, increased manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, and leaned the fuel mixture. The instrument panel showed readings that were unconventional, almost radical. Yet the engines responded smoothly, humming with a controlled power that seemed almost miraculous to the observers. The mechanics, who had initially questioned his approach, now nodded in cautious approval. Takeoff was flawless. The P-38 lifted into the humid New Guinea airfield with a grace that belied the modifications in flight technique. Lindbergh guided the aircraft through formation maneuvers, banking and climbing in ways that preserved fuel while maintaining speed and altitude. The accompanying pilots noticed immediately the difference. Where they had previously flown missions at near maximum RPM, consuming precious gallons of fuel, Lindbergh's technique allowed them to stretch every drop. Missions that had been limited to 570 miles could now extend to 750, an increase that could turn impossible strikes into routine operations. Over the course of 50 combat missions, Lindbergh demonstrated the practicality of his approach. He flew deep into enemy-held territory, sometimes escorting bombing raids, other times scouting isolated islands, always monitoring fuel consumption with the precision of a mathematician as much as a pilot. Each successful flight reinforced his credibility. Pilots began to whisper not of his controversial past, but of his extraordinary skill. They saw firsthand that a carefully controlled oversquare engine did not explode, that reducing RPM did not cause mechanical failure, and that the plane returned with ample reserves. The psychological impact on the pilots was immediate. For the first time, they felt a margin of safety, where previously there had been none. Long-range missions no longer meant gambling on fate. They could now plan with confidence, knowing that the aircraft could carry them home, even if unexpected detours or combat delays occurred. Lindbergh's flights became a living testament to the principles he had long espoused: precision, calculation, and respect for the machine. The commanding officers, initially skeptical, could not ignore the evidence. Flight logs and post-mission reports demonstrated conclusively that Lindbergh's methods increased range by nearly 1/3 without compromising engine integrity. He had not only validated his theory, but had done so under the harshest conditions of combat. The impact of these flights rippled through the squadron. Younger pilots, inspired by his example, began experimenting under supervision, learning to read their instruments in ways that maximized efficiency. What had once been theoretical calculations became operational knowledge, integrated into the daily routine of aerial warfare. Lindbergh's success also had strategic implications. The extended range allowed for deep strike missions against Japanese positions that had previously been unreachable without risking pilot lives. His flights directly supported General MacArthur's island hopping campaign, enabling operations that would have been considered impossible just weeks earlier. Moreover, the demonstration of fuel efficiency and engine reliability became a model for other squadrons across the Pacific theater, influencing doctrine and practice on a larger scale. Through 50 missions, the civilian pilot had achieved what many in the military deemed unthinkable. Lindbergh had turned theory into practice, risk into opportunity, and skepticism into admiration. The sight of a P-38 returning with ample fuel, having penetrated enemy territory safely, was more persuasive than any report or lecture. He had proven that one man, armed with knowledge and courage, could change the way a war was fought. By the end of his tenure in the Pacific, Lindbergh was no longer merely the disgraced celebrity of the pre-war years. He had become a living symbol of innovation, skill, and the quiet power of understanding a machine to its fullest potential. His personal demonstrations had forever altered the combat capabilities of America's premier fighter, saving lives and reshaping the strategic map of the Pacific Air War. The impact of Charles Lindbergh's methods became unmistakable when he began working directly with the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, the so-called Satan's Angels. These were men who had already earned fame and respect for their daring and skill in the Pacific theater. Some of the highest scoring aces in American history, Richard Bong, the nation's top scoring ace, and Thomas Maguire, another legendary figure, were initially skeptical of the civilian who had appeared at their remote New Guinea base. To them, Lindbergh was an enigma, a man of fame and controversy, now insisting he could teach combat-hardened pilots to fly farther and fight longer without risk to the aircraft. Yet skepticism soon gave way to fascination as they watched him demonstrate the power of his techniques. Lindbergh's first encounters with the squadron were as much psychological as technical. He did not arrive with a show of authority or demand respect. Instead, he observed quietly, asking detailed questions about fuel consumption, engine behavior, and mission planning. He listened as the pilots recounted the limitations they faced, the missions they had aborted due to fuel shortages, and the constant anxiety of returning from a strike with barely enough to reach home. His questions were probing, but never condescending. There was a subtle genius in his method. By showing respect for the pilots' experience while gently pointing out inefficiencies, he began to win their trust. Once trust was established, Lindbergh moved to practical instruction. He began with classroom-style sessions, using chalkboards and diagrams to illustrate his over-square engine technique, lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, and leaner fuel mixture. The aces listened, some with folded arms, others leaning in to see the instruments more clearly. Initially, there was doubt. Could these adjustments really extend the P-38's range by hundreds of miles without risking catastrophic engine failure? Lindbergh answered with precision, citing engineering principles, historical examples, and his own experience from the 1927 transatlantic flight. The logic was undeniable, even if it contradicted military doctrine. The real turning point came when Lindbergh invited the pilots to join him in the air. He didn't merely lecture. He flew alongside them, demonstrating the technique in real time. Formation flights showcased how adjusting RPM and manifold pressure allowed for longer endurance without sacrificing speed or maneuverability. The difference was immediately evident. The planes returned with substantial fuel reserves, even after missions that had previously pushed the limits of operational range. The young pilots, many of whom had doubted him, were now converts. Their awe tempered by practical results. Working alongside America's top aces, Lindbergh tailored his guidance to each pilot's style. Richard Bong, known for aggressive maneuvers and relentless pursuit of enemy aircraft, learned how to balance high-speed attack runs with fuel-efficient cruising, preserving energy for extended combat. Thomas Maguire, a tactical thinker and careful planner, absorbed the calculations, applying them to complex missions that demanded precise timing and range management. Lindbergh's methods didn't replace their skill, they enhanced it, providing a margin of safety and operational flexibility that had previously been impossible. As more pilots adopted the technique, a cultural shift began within the squadron. The initial skepticism gave way to admiration, and even enthusiasm. Lindbergh was no longer just a controversial civilian, he was a mentor, a teacher, and a symbol of innovation that bridged the gap between experience and science. Young pilots watched as the aces implemented his methods, and a ripple effect spread throughout the unit. Flight logs showed longer ranges, increased mission success rates, and reduced engine failures. The morale of the pilots improved as well. The fear of running out of fuel, a constant specter over every mission, was now mitigated by knowledge and skill. This human aspect of Lindbergh's work was as important as the technical achievements. By demonstrating courage and competence alongside the men he taught, he earned respect that mere rank or authority could never command. He had no uniform, no official command, yet his influence reshaped the squadron from within. The aces, who had once been skeptical, now became advocates. They relayed the techniques to newer pilots, multiplying the effect across missions and operational theaters. In many ways, Lindbergh's presence acted as a catalyst, transforming a squadron of highly skilled individuals into a more cohesive, efficient, and capable fighting force. By the end of his tenure with the 475th, Lindbergh had done more than prove a technical theory, he had changed the very culture of the unit. He demonstrated that innovation, when combined with practical application and personal example, could overcome resistance, skepticism, and even institutional inertia. The P-38 Lightning became not only a more effective aircraft, but also a symbol of what one man, armed with knowledge and courage, could achieve when he challenged convention and worked directly with those willing to learn. The success of these flights with America's top aces would resonate throughout the Pacific campaign, illustrating that mastery and mentorship could be as decisive as firepower in the outcome of war. By late 1944, the quiet revolution that Charles Lindbergh had begun at a remote airfield in New Guinea could no longer be ignored. His demonstrations with the 475th Fighter Group had proved conclusively that the P-38 Lightning could fly significantly farther than military doctrine had allowed. Fuel consumption was reduced, engine wear minimized, and operational range extended by nearly 1/3. The implications were staggering. What had begun as the curiosity of a controversial civilian was on the verge of transforming official U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine, altering the strategies and capabilities of the Pacific Air War. The first signs of institutional acknowledgement were cautious. Commanders who had initially dismissed Lindbergh's methods as dangerous or irrelevant were confronted with irrefutable evidence, flight logs, mission reports, and personal testimonies from aces like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. Here was a method that had been tested under the harshest conditions of combat, with remarkable results. The extended range allowed for missions that had previously been considered impossible, deep strike operations that could reach enemy positions hundreds of miles further than before. Emergency fuel reserves increased pilot survival rates, turning missions that were once borderline suicidal into calculated, manageable risks. Despite the data, adoption was not immediate. Military bureaucracy is rarely swift, particularly in wartime, and changing doctrine requires more than results, it requires formal approval. Lindbergh's civilian status complicated matters further. A man without rank or official commission had challenged long-standing principles. And to sanction his methods was to admit the military had been overly cautious, perhaps even inefficient, for years. Yet his repeated demonstrations left no room for doubt. As word of his successes spread through the Pacific commands, senior officers began ordering technical reviews, commissioning studies to validate his approach. Engineers scrutinized his calculations, monitored engine performance under the proposed over-square settings, and compared them to standard operational procedures. Each test confirmed the same truth: Lindbergh's method worked, safely and reliably. The transformation of doctrine was gradual but deliberate. Manuals and training materials began to incorporate Lindbergh's recommendations. Pilots were instructed on reducing RPM to 1/600, increasing manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, and utilizing auto-lean mixture during cruise. Flight instructors adjusted their teaching to reflect the new standards, emphasizing efficiency without compromising safety. The language of caution, once rigid and unquestionable, began to acknowledge the nuances of expert technique. What had started as a personal demonstration had become formalized guidance, shaping the behavior of every P-38 pilot in the theater. The broader strategic implications were immediate and profound. The Pacific theater presented unique challenges: vast distances, isolated islands, and supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Previously, the limitations of aircraft range constrained operational planning. Commanders had to factor in fuel margins that limited the depth and flexibility of missions. With Lindbergh's techniques now integrated into standard practice, those constraints loosened. Pilots could reach targets deeper into enemy territory, provide longer escort missions for bombers, and engage in reconnaissance operations that had been impossible before. The operational map expanded, giving commanders new options and greater tactical freedom. Lindbergh's influence also reshaped the culture of innovation within the air forces. His work demonstrated that valuable ideas could come from outside the traditional chain of command, from those willing to challenge orthodoxy with expertise and courage. Younger pilots and mechanics, inspired by his practical demonstrations, began to think critically about their aircraft, testing assumptions and seeking ways to maximize efficiency. The willingness to adopt proven techniques, even when they came from a civilian, reinforced the idea that ingenuity and evidence-based methods were as critical as rank or experience in a war that demanded constant adaptation. By the end of 1944, the adoption of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency techniques had become standard practice across squadrons equipped with the P-38 Lightning. Mission planning now accounted for the increased range, emergency reserves, and endurance provided by his methods. The number of aborted missions, due to fuel shortages, decreased sharply, and the reliability of aircraft on long sorties increased. Pilots returned with greater confidence, knowing that the margin for error had expanded. The air war in the Pacific, once constrained by mechanical limitations, now reflected the mastery of one man's understanding of his machine, amplified across an entire theater of operations. Lindbergh's contributions were not just technical, they were transformative. He had challenged authority, demonstrated innovation under fire, and reshaped institutional practices in the middle of a global conflict. His techniques became more than a pilot's tool. They became a part of the doctrine that defined American air power in the Pacific. The legacy of his work illustrated a fundamental truth, that in war, knowledge applied with precision can be as decisive as any weapon, and that sometimes the most profound advancements come not from laboratories or bureaucracies, but from the courage of an individual to defy convention and demonstrate what is possible. The story of Charles Lindbergh's influence on the Pacific Air War does not end with the adoption of his techniques by the U.S. Army Air Forces. It extends far beyond, leaving a legacy that would resonate long after the final battles of World War II had been fought. By the time Lindbergh concluded his work with the 475th Fighter Group, the P-38 Lightning had been transformed from a formidable, but range-limited fighter into a weapon capable of striking deeper into enemy territory than anyone had previously imagined. Missions that once teetered on the edge of impossibility were now routine. The integration of his methods into official doctrine not only saved lives, but also demonstrated the enduring power of innovation, courage, and expertise applied in the crucible of war. The impact on pilots was immediate and profound. For the young men flying the P-38As, the fear of running out of fuel, a constant, invisible enemy, had been omnipresent. Every mission required careful calculation and a nervous eye on the gauges. With Lindbergh's techniques, that fear was replaced with a calculated confidence. Pilots could push further, linger longer over targets, and maintain a tactical advantage without the constant anxiety of fuel depletion. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. When a pilot knows he has the range to retreat, to maneuver, or to outlast the enemy, his operational effectiveness increases dramatically. It is one thing to survive a mission by chance. It is another to do so by design. Beyond the personal experience of individual pilots, Lindbergh's influence altered the very structure of aerial combat planning. Commanders could now plan missions with greater flexibility. Long-range strikes, previously considered perilous or impractical, became viable options. Strategic targets on distant islands, once unreachable, could now be attacked with precision. Escort missions for bombers were safer and more effective. The ripple effect extended through the Pacific theater. Japanese forces faced an enemy that could project power farther and with greater endurance, fundamentally shifting the balance of aerial operations. Lindbergh's civilian insight had translated into a strategic advantage for an entire military force. What made Lindbergh's legacy so remarkable was the manner in which he achieved it. He did not command troops. He did not hold rank. He had no authority to enforce his ideas. Yet through demonstration, mentorship, and meticulous calculation, he earned the trust of combat pilots and the grudging respect of commanders. His presence challenged the rigid military orthodoxy, proving that innovation does not always emerge from hierarchical institutions. Sometimes, it is the individual, working quietly, observing keenly, and applying knowledge with precision, who reshapes the battlefield. Lindbergh's success reinforced a broader principle of wartime leadership: ideas, proven effective, can transcend formal authority, and results speak louder than titles. The practical applications of Lindbergh's techniques extended beyond immediate combat benefits. By reducing engine strain and optimizing fuel consumption, aircraft maintenance requirements were decreased. Engines lasted longer, and the risk of mechanical failure dropped significantly. This increased the operational readiness of squadrons and allowed for sustained campaigns over the course of months. Every aircraft that returned safely with extra fuel was a testament to the foresight and ingenuity of one man who refused to accept conventional limits. The efficiency gained was not abstract. It had tangible consequences in the survival of pilots, the success of missions, and the overall momentum of the Allied air campaign. Lindbergh's influence also had a human dimension that extended beyond technical calculations. By demonstrating his methods personally, flying 50 combat missions alongside the pilots he sought to teach, he inspired confidence and admiration. The aces, initially skeptical, became advocates. Young pilots, witnessing their elders' respect for Lindbergh, quickly absorbed his principles. The lessons were not merely mechanical. They were ethical and practical lessons in courage, precision, and the responsibility that comes with skill. Lindbergh showed that mastery of one's craft could save lives and shift the tide of conflict. That excellence was inseparable from accountability. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Lindbergh's contribution lies in its symbolism. His work illustrates the intersection of knowledge, courage, and opportunity. A civilian, once sidelined and controversial, stepped into the crucible of war and applied expertise with decisive effect. His influence demonstrates that innovation is not confined to laboratories, academies, or command centers. It can emerge wherever intellect meets necessity, and where one individual refuses to accept imposed limitations. The P-38 Lightning, transformed by his insight, became more than a plane. It became a testament to what is possible when human ingenuity confronts the challenges of war. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's legacy in the Pacific theater is not measured merely in miles gained or fuel saved, though those achievements were extraordinary. It is measured in the lives preserved, the missions made possible, and the culture of innovation he inspired. He proved that the most significant advancements in warfare often come from those willing to challenge convention, to trust observation and calculation over doctrine, and to demonstrate, rather than dictate, their vision. The story of Charles Lindbergh's civilian intervention is a reminder that the greatest revolutions sometimes begin with a single individual, quietly changing the rules and leaving a mark on history that endures long after the guns have fallen silent.